Thank you for joining the Levers for Change podcast, where we search for who is responsible for what in making an impact on the environment, the energy systems, and the economy. Today's guest is Karen Wayland. She started off her career as a Congressional Science Fellow for U.S. Senator Harry Reid. After a stint as the legislative director at the Natural Resource Defense Council, she returned to Washington, D.C. as a senior policy advisor to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. We met up in San Diego a few months ago, and as we found out a few minutes into our conversation, we were sitting directly under the flight path of the San Diego International Airport, so we'll be accompanied by an occasional jet. You can find out more about this episode and about Karen's work at our website, www.leversforchangepodcast.com. Please remember to subscribe and share the episode. And now, let's see how a trained geologist ended up in Washington, D.C. Well, Karen, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for being part of this podcast.
My pleasure, Jimmy.
Great. You know, you started off your career as a geologist and geophysicist.
Geochemist.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and how that framed the way that you look at the energy issues today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always wanted to build dams when I was growing up. I spent a lot of time with hoses and twigs and, running little streams all over the place. And then when I got to college and I was in the civil engineering program, I realized it was a very linear, dry program, and that I really didn't want to build dams. And it turns out that was a really good career move because people aren't really building dams, and it turns out to be a highly controversial way to generate energy.
If anything, they're tearing dams down.
Exactly.
Days, right?
So I ended up doing my bachelor's degrees in economics with a kind of focus on international development. And there was a kind of a water element to it, mainly about access to water and women and water. And then I realized that I probably needed to keep going with my degrees, and so I got a master's degree in watershed management. Well, it was in the College of Ag at University of Connecticut, and I did a lot of work on non-point source pollution from agriculture. I did a lot of groundwater quality and stream water quality monitoring, and got a PhD in both watershed management, but then as I was working on that program, I realized that was not scientific enough. It was a lot of the management side of natural resources. And it's not that I didn't want to have that, because I've always done a kind of a dual policy and science track, but I really felt like my PhD should be heavy into the science. So I ended up doing a dual degree in the geology department and in the resource development department at Michigan State. And there I spent a lot of time looking at urban non-point source pollution and the interaction of groundwater and stream water with land use. And so again, it was very technical, very scientific, but there was always kind of this bridge to application and to managing natural resources. And then I thought, well, what's my next step? Wasn't sure I wanted to go into academia, and I saw an announcement for a Congressional Science Fellowship through the American Geophysical Union, and I applied for it, and I got it. And I had gotten an agreement from my advisor that I could finish at the end of the summer, but he wasn't really paying attention. He was famous for not finishing students, like dragging on their PhDs long after, even the 8 years and getting extensions. And I said, I don't want any part of that. And I ended up getting the offer to go to Washington to be a Congressional Science Fellow, which was great because it forced my committee to actually finish me when I wanted to be finished and not when they got around to it. So that's how I ended up in Washington. And when you're a Congressional Science Fellow, your office doesn't necessarily take advantage of your technical background. They take advantage of the fact that you're a smart body sitting in their office, and they kind of throw whatever they want at you. And so that's how I started working on energy issues. It's how I ended up picking up the Indian Affairs Committee work. So I worked on Native American issues. I worked on nuclear waste issues. Nothing that really was water. I'd had a couple water-related projects, but it's really how I came to Washington and how I started learning about energy issues.
So in some ways it was just given to you. And, these energy issues. And,
yeah.
And
it was just
pick it up really quickly as fast as you can.
That's exactly right. I was learning the people, I was learning the process, I was learning the history of the issues, and then I was learning like the basic issues around, and even things that were related to water and geology, like hydraulic fracturing. I didn't really know anything about it, but when I was working for Reid's office, they were moving a big comprehensive energy bill that included some exemptions to the Clean Water Act for hydraulic fracturing. And so I ended up being, because I was a geologist, because I knew water, they threw me into those conference negotiations. I didn't know the law. I didn't know Clean Water Act. I didn't know, and those were the things, and that's an energy issue, so because it was part of the energy bill.
Right.
And I ended up being part of those discussions. So that's how I entered the big policy debates, by being thrown into them.
So you mentioned, Senator Harry Reid, who you worked with as the Congressional Science Fellow, and then eventually you went off to work for Nancy Pelosi as well as Speaker of the House. How would you say is the tenor of the Senate and the House different in the way that it approached energy issues?
That's a great question. Well, they're fundamentally at different places by design. The framers of the Constitution saw the House as the kind of the people's body. And so you've got 435 members, you've got, seniority becomes really important in the House. The committee work is very important because you've got too many people, so you have to manage through the committees. And so the committee chairs are very important. They actually, the staff on House committees get paid better than the staff on the Senate committees, because the body of the work, like the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, about 60% of the business of the House goes through Energy and Commerce because it's got such a broad jurisdiction. And then you think about the Senate. The Senate is, they say it's the saucer to cool the tea that comes over from the House. And so it moves more slowly. It's supposed to be the deliberative body, the debate style on the floor. You have unlimited debate, so a member can just go down and talk and talk and talk. Supposedly every member is supposed to be equal, so there's 100 members and they're supposed to be equal. Of course, we know that's not totally true, because the freshmen, the junior senators get the worst offices, but they all can go down and object to holding up a bill. And so they're just two different places. And leadership, I worked for Harry Reid when he was the majority whip, and then I worked for Nancy Pelosi when she was the speaker. And the styles of leadership have to be different, because you have 100 people. Basically, you're overseeing a caucus of somewhere between 45 and 55 members, or 60 if you're lucky. And the House, you've got 230 something members that you're trying to manage. And so there's a much different way of managing your caucus in the House and the Senate, just because of the nature of the building, the nature of the chambers.
So then how does that influence, an energy bill or an energy policy that's trying to get implemented? When you were in the House, how would you work with your Senate counterpart, and vice versa? Well,
that is interesting, because when I was in the House, we passed the Waxman Markey Climate Bill, and we passed health care, and we passed a number of very large bills. And the Senate Democrats were looking at us like, can you help us? Can you help us? It's not easier to pass a bill in the House. It's just a different process. In the House, once you get a bill through the committee, that's where most of the deliberation happens, is in the committee. And so you're churning through weeks of hearings and weeks of markups and amendments, and every member will throw every amendment that they have at the bill. And that's where the majority of the fights happen. And then when you bring a bill that's gone, and of course in the House too, there are all these committees that want sequential jurisdiction. And so they may all hold hearings and markups of the bill. And then you've got this bill that's been through an incredible legislative process before it gets to the House floor. And then when the bill goes to the House floor, members can propose amendments, but all those amendments go to the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee decides which amendments will actually get debated on the floor.
So it's easier to get an amendment on the committee than it is to get it on the House floor.
That's right. So there will only be a few amendments. There'll be more amendments offered by the majority than the minority, but usually the Rules Committee will let one or two amendments go. And then the minority has one last attempt to do something to the bill, and it's a motion to recommit. And so they can throw something out there that's usually a message thing, that kind of a gotcha vote. On natural resources, they would always do things like, there was a scandal about the Interior staff looking at porn on their computers. And so there would be these gotcha motion to recommits that would say, none of these funds can be spent to watch porn. And if you voted no, against the motion to recommit, you were subject to, bad ads where, you could say you voted to watch porn, to let Interior staff watch porn. So on the Senate side, the committees are important, but they're not the only place that debate happens. That a lot of work can happen on the Senate floor, and it's designed that way. So a bill will move through the committee, and then it'll come to the floor, and there are all these rules and traditions about how long a bill should be on the floor and what the procedures are, and those are not as strict as it's not the word strict, maybe honored as they were before. I mean, the Senate just doesn't bring bills to the floor and have them on the floor for a couple weeks like they used to debating amendments, and that's just not happening.
Right. The tradition has eroded.
Yeah, it has. Yeah. So that was the difference. But now people are talking about getting rid of the filibuster entirely, which is, because it's been overused. But it was a way to kind of let the hot tea that came over from the House cool and to be subject to a more deliberative discussion about the issues.
Mm-hmm. Did you, and just from your personal experience, did you find one or the other more open to the types of energy policy work?
No, I loved both. I mean, I loved both. The House, we actually moved more bills just because of, we were in charge. And then when I worked in the Senate, for most of the time I was there, we were also in charge. The Democrats were also in charge, and so we were able to move things. Mm-hmm. But they have their strengths and weaknesses. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to be in the minority on the House side, because there you don't do much. You throw bombs. You don't have a lot of power. The Speaker really controls the power of the House. Right?
So just to understand a little bit better about that committee structure, then it sounds like there are staffers both hired to help the committee, but then there's also staffers for each member of the House.
That's right.
So then do you have to start interacting?
I do.
How do those...
that's a really interesting question. I think we talked about this. I made a mistake one time when I was being interviewed for a job when they said, did you supervise anybody in the Speaker's office? And the answer is no, I didn't have any direct reports. But my husband, who at that point was working for leadership on the Senate side, has been asked that question. He said, well, I have to oversee all of these people and all of these members, and that's exactly what I had to do. Was I had a worse job than just managing a group of people, because I had to manage those people and the issues for an outcome, and none of them reported directly to me. So I managed a lot of people and a lot of high-powered people that, chairs of committees I had to go talk to and tell them what the Speaker wanted to do, and I had to implement her agenda by working with staff. And so there's the committee staff, you're right, there's committee staff, and then each member has their own personal staff. And sometimes you don't have to deal with the personal staff, but if they don't have a really strong role, like a committee chair or a subcommittee chair, but they have a strong interest in an issue, then you're dealing with both the member and their staff on it. So you're talking like sometimes I would have these coordinating meetings on a bill where there'd be 60, 70, 80 people in the room that I would be managing. So they weren't direct reports to me at all, and I had to take in all of their concerns and things. And then that's not even talking about all the outside interests that want to influence the process and be part of the process. And I'd have to call them all in together and figure out what they were looking and who they were talking to. And and it was hard for us to track all the votes on it. So we often would rely on the outside groups who were having all of these meetings with members to figure out where we were on moving a particular bill.
Right, and if I understand correctly, it's the whip position is supposed to be the person who's counting the votes internally for the two parties and both sides of the...
So in the House, because there's so many members, there's a whip who's the third in line. So there's the Speaker, the Majority Leader, and then the whip, and that's Mr. Clyburn right now from South Carolina. And then there are all these deputy whips, and they're usually organized around regions, and then they have a whole list of members that they're responsible for counting.
Right. And so what you mentioned was a good segue of talking about how the internal organization works to then how it interacts with the ecosystem.
Yeah.
We hear a lot about lobbyists. We hear a lot about it, I think, from people on the outside who are trying to lobby into Congress. But you were inside.
And I was a lobbyist.
And you were a lobbyist.
I was a registered lobbyist for a nonprofit.
So what is it like when you're on the inside and you're getting inundated with these lobby requests?
So actually, they help do your work. They can help you, and this is not a bad thing. I just think that there needs to be a lot of transparency around the fact that they represent constituents, whether it's a nonprofit environmental organization or a lobbyist that's representing a company. They are representing an interest that has a legitimate reason, a legitimate right to want to be part of the lawmaking process. So I don't have the jaded view of lobbyists that a lot of people do, because people don't have the time to and the knowledge and the understanding and the access to understand how to be part of the legislative process. And people who are in Washington who know the system help to bring people's views and issues to light. And they often know the issues better than the average staffer. I mean, especially in the House side, a personal office probably has like a staffer will be 25, has a million different things on their plate. And like I said, coming into Congress, I didn't know the issues. I was thrown into representing the member in these venues, but I had to find people you trust. I mean, the Native American issues were a classic issue because some of those are dealing with treaties that go back to the 1800s, and then law built on top of law, and then court case built on court case. And so there's this body of knowledge that people who've been doing this all their life have that a staffer doesn't have. And so you gotta know who you can trust. I think it's important for the public to understand that lobbyists are bringing a certain viewpoint to, and we should know how much they're contributing to members, and all that is public. But it doesn't, they're still a really important part of the system, and they can provide you with fact sheets that you can actually look at and go, well, this is going to help me write the memo to my boss. This group wants this group cares about this, and I've got all the fact sheets here that tell us what they want out of the bill. So I think they're a vital part of the system, but transparency is really key to how they are part of the system.
And are there conversations with individual constituents and coming through as well, not just summarized by lobbyists?
Yeah. I think one of the most successful things that lobbyists can do, is, especially if they're working with nonprofit organization or local organizations, is to do what they call fly-ins, where they're bringing constituents in for day-long lobby trips. And I've run them. I've brought entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and energy workers in to meet with members, and we go half an hour by half an hour by half an hour. You just run from meeting to meeting, talking hopefully directly to the member, but sometimes to the staff, and staff are that's often a more fruitful meeting anyway. But those fly-ins, those meetings directly with the people that are affected are really important. And then every member has district offices, and they go back every weekend usually, and they're not sitting at home during those weekends. They're doing fundraisers, but they're also holding meetings with their constituencies and doing events and things like that. So those are really important.
And how did you perceive people balancing out the national issues versus local issues?
Oh, everything's local. Everything's local. Yeah, that's what I found is I've been working with the Energy Futures Initiative and the National Association of State Energy officials to produce this U.S. Energy and Employment Jobs Report. And we do a national report, which is surveying companies in the energy sector about who they employ, difficulties in hiring, what does their workforce look like, how much do they get paid. And then the survey goes deep into oversampling in the state so that you really get a good sense of what's happening in the state. And then you can break that data down into congressional districts and all the way down even, counties and state legislative districts. And those numbers at the congressional level and at the state level turn out to be, really, really important to the debate over clean energy policy. And so it's the national report. We looked at the numbers of downloads on this jobs report a couple months ago, and the national report had been downloaded a couple thousand times, and the state fact sheets, the total number of state fact sheet downloads was well over 3,000. So those state fact sheets were way more important, and that doesn't even include people who've saved them on their hard drive and are using them. We knew people used those jobs fact sheets in gubernatorial education meetings, and the energy efficiency advocates and companies that work in the energy efficiency space told me that they use those fact sheets for every meeting that they go to. They put it down in front of a member and say, these are the jobs in your district, because that's what the member most cares about, is how is it going to affect my district or my state.
Right.
So it's all local with some sense of a national agenda, but in the end, the accountability for members of Congress is at the local level.
So then when you're working for a Speaker of the House who is watching over a national issue or national policy, how do you tease that out from the various members?
That's why having conversations with members about what they are going to need to be able to support a bill is really important, and why those negotiations can be so in-depth and they're based on both a member's interest, but a member's constituents, and what the constituents need to see in order to support the member going forward. And so we paid a lot of attention to the 20, 30, 40 members who had real issues with a bill because they were going to have to explain their vote back home. So it's really important, and I think that's the thing you'll see watching the speaker right now, is that she is trying to make a safe place for all of her members, and not just the most vocal members, and not just the majority of her members.
Then how was your role, do you think, perceived on the global stage?
So we passed Waxman-Markey in June or July of June. Actually, it's the 10th anniversary this month, 2009, and that was also the United Nations negotiations on climate were in Copenhagen, and that was like the big international meeting that everybody was putting, high hopes on, is that Copenhagen meeting. And so I helped arrange the largest congressional delegation in the history of the House, a trip to the Copenhagen climate negotiations, because we had just passed Waxman-Markey and the world was watching. Mm-hmm. The world absolutely was watching. And so we had, I think, if I'm correct, we had 10 chairs of committees that went with us.
Wow.
And 4 ranking members with us, plus another 12 to 15 members that went along with the speaker, the majority leader, and I can't remember if Mr. Clyburn was there as well. But anyway, it's just this massive contingent of House leadership and rank and file members of both parties came with us. And so, so I was the one who negotiated all the meetings, where they were going to be, what they were doing, and that was wild to watch, that the world was watching what was happening in one chamber of one of our 3 branches of government. That was pretty amazing to see how they were paying attention.
Yeah, I always find it amazing when I travel globally, just to see the influence that our politics, our actions have on the global stage, when it's theoretically not part of their influence or part of their control.
Right. Well, we went to China. Chinese invited Speaker Pelosi to come to, when she had so it was early 2009, actually. It was before we passed Waxman-Markey, but she had a long history of fighting with the Chinese over human rights issues, and she even went to, after Tiananmen, she went to China when she was a junior member of the House, and with a couple other members, and unfurled a sign out in the Tiananmen Square, taking China to task. And so they were not big fans of Nancy Pelosi, and she was not a big fan of China. But when she became the speaker and she made climate change her signature issue, they invited her to come for a state visit to China. And it was a wild experience to be part of that trip.
Yeah. I want to talk about a bit more of your individual role as you played with all these different players and moving parts and everything. How did you, as an advisor, as the energy policy advisor, how did you find influence on these issues, and how were you able to get consensus and things done?
First and foremost, I was representing very powerful people. So when I spoke with the power of those people behind me. And I remember one time having trouble with a committee for quite a while, and it was when I was a fellow. I was very young at this process, and our legislative director, who said to me, "Come on, we're going to go over to see Senator Reid." And he never went to these committee hearings, and all of a sudden, but I'd always prepare a notebook, and I would always send my recommendations for votes to him, and he would usually send a proxy back so that he didn't have to go to all these hearings. And so this one particular hearing, after I'd had a really hard time getting the committee staff to provide me with bills ahead of time to review, I went in to meet with him, and he said, "Okay, let's go." And I said, "What?" And we went back down on the subway that goes underneath from the Capitol over to the hearing, and he was going to the hearing with me. And he said, I understand they treat you very badly. And I said, "No, Senator, no, everything's fine. Everything's fine." He said, No, I won't have it, because the way you treat you is the way they treat me. So what he was saying was, I can't let them treat you this way, because you are representing my interests, and I need to make sure that you get the information that you need in order to help me make my decisions. So he showed up at the hearing, and they were, the chair and the ranking member were quite surprised, because he never showed up, and he made it very clear that I was to get all the information. And he ended up noting, when they went through the opening statements, they got to him, and he said, "Thank you for having me, and I note the absence of a quorum." And he shut the markup down because the staff had not been providing me with information. So he stopped a markup as a result. It was partly to protect me. It was a really wonderful thing, but it was also that if his staff couldn't do their job, then he can't do his job. And so he made it very clear what he was expecting. So that's the kind of thing, not every member would do that, and not every member could do that, but it just shows you that when I show up, I'm actually representing that power behind me. So that's one of the things that I was showing up in these meetings with big guns behind me.
With the big guns, and then
Yeah.
you bring the intellectual heft of what it is that you're actually
Yeah,
doing.
well, I mean,
So
I did
that
a lot
certainly
of,
helped.
but I did a lot of when I was at the Natural Resources Defense Council. I actually managed a lot of coalitions, and
Yeah.
a huge coalition of groups working on climate and energy. And I had to figure out how to, even just writing a letter that we'd get 30 groups to sign on to, it takes a lot of consensus building. And
Yeah.
so I learned, and I ran these huge meetings with lots of different groups, and I just kind of learned how to manage these large, very difficult coalitions, which helped me certainly when I worked for the speaker.
Yeah, and so speaking about that, these coalitions move slowly, just by definition, because there's so many people you have to coordinate, and then House and Senate, the bills move slowly because of all the different issues going on in different members.
Yeah.
What does success look like then?
So when we were working on climate bills in the early days, where Senator Lieberman and Senator McCain were working on bipartisan climate bills in the very beginning, what we measured success was the number of people who voted for our bill increasing from last year to the next year. So in one congressional session, we got 42 votes on a climate bill, and then we worked. That was kind of a position forcing bill, and we found out who was ready to vote for a cap and trade bill and who came close and was willing to have conversations with us, and then who was flat out against us. And you usually rank, when you have these conversations with members, you start ranking them 1 through 5. 1, they're definitely with you. 1, they're definitely against you. 3, they're on the fence. 2s and 4s, they could be pushed, so you got to watch them. But that's how we did our vote counts, was 1 through 5. And so when we had a vote for 42 in support of the bill, even though it was not even close to a majority and not even certainly close to the 60, we then had a roadmap to how to approach another 15, 20 members based on that vote. And so the next time that big climate bill came to the floor in the Senate, we got 46 votes, and that was, for us, that was success. We turned 4 members. We got 4 more members to understand the issues and to understand how to sell it to their constituents, and that's success, even without actually delivering on a bill that the president signs.
And I would assume to get those 4 additional votes, you had to learn those local issues that they had to care about.
Absolutely.
And
And then a lot of these groups that worked in the coalition had local presence. So they would take the intel that we get from Washington, and they would go into the local districts and find constituents who could talk to the member and who could deliver the message. And issue advocacy campaigns spend a lot of time at the local level trying to find voices that the members care about. And so you do a lot of grassroots and grass tops, which are the kind of influencer people, to back in the district, and then that intel gets fed into kind of the national coordinating campaign, and it's a back and forth. So running those coalitions is a very complex task.
So in some of the documents that are published, like the Quadrennial Energy Review and whatnot, there's obviously a lot about energy, whether it's electricity or natural gas, but there's also a big section on water and a big section on smart grid, cybersecurity, and these issues, which many people consider non-traditional energy issues. So how do you manage these non-traditional energy issues in parallel, in conjunction with these more traditional energy issues?
Well, I think it's seeing the connections, first of all, and that was one of the really interesting things about the Quadrennial Energy Review, which was that we looked at energy as a system. And so then you look at all the different parts of the system. And actually some people were very bored with the traditional energy issues, but found the energy-water nexus to be really exciting and interesting because it was fairly new. And some people who could care less about energy care about national security, and will have you scare the bejesus out of them when you start talking about all the cybersecurity risks with the changing nature of the electricity system. So it was just mainly making sure that we were looking at things as a system.
Yeah, and so, that review was published under Secretary Moniz. He was the one who pulled it together and said, this needs to get done. But then when we let's overlay that on top of congressional committee structures.
Yeah.
Did you have to work with different committees? Did it go to different committees? Do they have to break it down then to their specific issues?
Yes, they did. That was a really interesting report, in that there are lots of big reports that that different administrations put out. But that first Quadrennial Energy Review resulted in over half of our recommendations being picked up by committees, and they got moved in a couple different bills. It was mainly the Energy and Commerce Committee, but we spent a lot of time. I went around the country. I probably gave 70 talks on the first Quadrennial Energy Review, at state association meetings, at the regulatory commission meetings, at the but all over. And that was to kind of educate the broader group of stakeholders about what we were recommending so that they could help reinforce to members that as a federal employee, I couldn't lobby and I couldn't tell people to lobby. But when you kind of lay out an agenda for here are the problems that we see in the electricity system, here are the opportunities, and here are our recommendations, it was a pretty compelling report, and we didn't have to sell it that hard for the committee. And, you know, when you think about the length of time it had been since a major energy bill had been picked up, there was a lot of appetite for here's a problem that you've identified, a very concrete problem, and here's a solution that we can quickly attach it to. And we also, when we put together the report, it wasn't just a bunch of experts getting together. We did a lot of time going around the country doing stakeholder meetings, and we built a whole website to allow people to provide input and recommendations into us, and we relied very heavily on that stakeholder engagement so that our recommendations were kind of truth tested before we actually even threw them out to the public, which helped the receptivity in the Hill.
Somewhere in there you mentioned something, I want to tease out a little bit more, standalone energy bill versus policies that are embedded in other bills.
Right.
How do you manage that interaction of which strategy is the right one? You know, shoot for a big standalone bill or put it into someone else?
I think it's where the opportunity knocks at this point, because Congress is so dysfunctional that, you know, I look at kind of sector by sector. If we're going to look at, you know, all the carbon tons that are coming out of our economy, a big, huge, comprehensive climate bill, the politics just aren't there. They're not going to be there. But we know that a farm bill moves every 6 years, a transportation bill moves every 6 years, and those used to be the traditional windows when you'd get these big bills to move. They're kind of changing and now. But you know that a defense authorization bill is going to pass. You know a defense appropriations bill is going to pass. You know those have to pass or must pass bills. So, okay, let's look at where the opportunities are in the farm bill to move energy policy. Let's look at where in the transportation bill there are opportunities to deal with it. And so those are still really big bills, but from an energy standpoint, you're a small piece of that. You could be a pretty large piece of it, but it's one part of a larger agenda, and it's an opportunity. So.
Right. And I remember one of the farm bills under George Bush Jr. was actually a farm, agriculture, and energy bill.
I think that's the bill that created it created some of the clean energy programs within the USDA for rural America.
Right. Even though we're talking about energy, and now we're starting to talk about water and some of these other non-energy issues, what would you say are some of the, Congress is looking at a myriad of issues, not just energy. Which ones do you think might be more important than energy or might draw away attention from that as a core issue?
Judges, healthcare, gun rights. But there are those who say that there's no more existential threat to the planet than climate, and I am one of those. But in terms of what the public is caring about right now, I mean, this is changing, which is kind of an exciting thing to see that's happened over the last year or so. But in general, climate hasn't been one of the things that people stood up in town halls and screamed at members about. So, and again, there are these must-pass things like appropriations that just sometimes just suck the air out of the ability to do anything else. Right now, the climate for getting real legislation of any stripe through is just really difficult. And so, that's why I think, we've been spending a lot of time talking about Congress, but we haven't even gotten to the states, which is where the real action is happening. And I remember when I was a political appointee in the Obama administration, and when Secretary Moniz was nominated before he was secretary, I had a meeting with him where he said, well, what do you want to do for, at DOE? And I said, well, what would you like me to do? I'm here, at your service. And so I knew they were going to bring me on board, but I had no idea what they were going to bring me on board to do. And they ended up creating, one of his top priorities was what he called raising the game with the states. They created a new policy office and created one team of state, local, tribal policy. And then I got to run that team for him. And I kept saying, I am so glad he gave me this job because I don't have to work, in Washington. I can go out and see all the really cool things that are happening in the states in clean energy.
Yeah, I think one of the things I love playing with you is just throwing out a name and seeing how you know the person. You seem to know everyone who is anywhere in energy nationally, and that's just, I think, one of the great things about that.
But that's because I was in these positions where I was able to had access to some really powerful people, and so people came to me. So that's a big thing between having access and then no longer working for important people is people aren't calling me all the time.
Only insurance spammers now are
Exactly,
calling
right.
you all the time, right?
Right.
Certainly, I think talking about those state issues is ripe for another conversation.
Yeah.
So there's just so much there. So let's just focus on the federal level, since that's where most of this conversation has been. Where did you find that you could make decisions really quickly? And where did you find that you had to really slow down and be patient and wait for a decision to happen?
Working in the House, you can make very quick decisions. You can just make things happen. You have a bill that's brewing, and it's sort of an instantaneous thing. There might be a couple months worth of committee hearings and things like that, but then it comes down to the floor, and all of those, the things you're doing are really instantaneous decisions. And then when it's done, you're on to the next big thing. And so that time frame of decision making is much more rapid than any place I've ever been before.
So in the committee, it sounds like they're super slow. In the House, at any rate, it's super slow in terms of the deliberation of what's going on. But then once it's on the floor,
on the floor, it's very quick. And then even committee here, even just a bill is moving. That staff have been working on it for months and months and months, but they're down in the weeds, and then I'm in the back, up in the Capitol, being lobbied by lots of different people, and also having lots of other issues on different other committees that I'm dealing with. And so the committee staff may be working, they worked 20 hours a day writing energy and climate bills. I worked really hard, but I wasn't writing the bills necessarily. So I was doing other things, and all those other things were instant decision making. They're like, you got to get a memo done. You got to get the secretary's the speaker's going to have a meeting tomorrow. So you got to quickly, learn an issue, come up with how she's ought to react to it, and make a recommendation and get that done. And then you're on to the next meeting, you're on to the next trip or the next bill that something else is on your agenda. So that just requires really, really fast decision making.
Yeah. Then what about ones where decisions were better when they were slower?
Well, I think the Quadrennial Energy Review. I mean, that was a we came in 2013. And the first Quadrennial Energy Review was released in 2000, I want to say late 15. So it took us not quite 2 years to do this big interagency bill where we had hundreds of different research projects with the national labs that fed in and were synthesized and written, and we had many interagency meetings and meetings with the White House and stakeholders, and that was a long process. The end result was a really incredible report that I'm very proud of being able to have been part of, and that ended up turning into legislation that was signed by the president. So that it was worth doing it right and doing it really comprehensively, and you couldn't do it. You couldn't do a report like that really quickly.
Yeah, you need all that stakeholder engagement. Yeah. So then for people who are coming up and beginning their careers, where do you think it's the best place for them to get started?
Well, I think everybody should have a stint in Washington, because I look on Facebook and I look on Twitter and I listen to the conversations that I have when out visiting friends and family outside Washington. They really truly do not understand the process. And I think it's useful to have a better understanding of the process so that you're more forgiving of the process and not so cynical about it or misinformed about it. Because, for example, the framers of the Constitution envisioned things moving fast in the House and things moving slow in the Senate, and that of the thousands of bills that are produced every year by all the 535 members, very few of them are ever become law by design. So I think Congress is really dysfunctional right now, but some of that is just by design, and if you really understand the way things work, there's a theater involved too, where Senator Reid used to meet regularly with Senator Lott, who was the minority leader or majority leader, when they flipped back and forth, and they would talk about how things were going to happen on the floor, and you knew which members of yours were kind of crazy, were going to have to go down and scream about things, and you kind of set it up so that everybody had their say, but then in the end you knew what the process was going to be. And I think people need to understand that there's a process, there's some theater involved, there's some history involved that people don't understand that influences how things happen. So I think a stint in Washington is
get rid important. Of a lot of the misunderstandings and what's going on, right? And so then the last question,
like a draft.
The draft. Oh, wouldn't that be wonderful for DC? where do you think are the biggest need for future expertise?
I think it's probably the regulatory sphere. They really need to understand, because policy moves much more slowly than technology. And we're not going to have a lot of big changes in national policy. So that means that state policy and the regulatory work at FERC and at the Public Utility Commissions is where that has a lot of influence on what actually happens in energy, how we deploy resources, how we compensate people who are providing those resources. And so I think that's hard to learn in college. So just starting out, trying to find ways that you can become more familiar with the policy and regulatory framework that you're operating in will help you move along in your career, actually, but help whoever you're working with.
Yeah. And one thing I found about regulatory regimes is it was very helpful to learn them through the lens of history.
Yeah.
How they got started and why they got set up,
Yeah.
to understand why they're operating the way that they do.
Exactly.
Today.
Exactly.
Cool. Any last words of advice?
No, this is fun.
Great.
This is fun.
Well, thank you so much for your time,
Yeah.
Karen. This was great.
Yeah, thanks.
You have been listening to the Levers for Change podcast, where we search for who has responsibility for what when implementing change. My name is Jimmy Gia, and the music is by Sean Hart. Please subscribe to our podcast for new episodes and share with a friend. Please visit our website at www.leversforchangepodcast.com for additional episodes, books, and other resources. Thank you again, and remember, when trying to change the world, search for your levers for change.